In a previous video, we looked at the benefits of U-space for unmanned aviation, such as obtaining information about other air traffic or simplifying the assessment of air risk. However, there are also a few drawbacks. Today, we want to take a look at these. We will focus on two key points: the uncertain and provisional nature of UAS flight authorizations and the expected costs. Let's start with the topic of uncertainty and provisionality. When using U-space airspaces, several things can happen that would prevent you from flying or from completing your flight as originally scheduled. Let's assume you would like to conduct a flight. How likely is it that your request for a UAS flight authorization for this flight would be successful? Consider airspace capacity. How many UAS can use the airspace at the same time? When designating U-space airspaces, the competent authority can determine the maximum number of drones that may be present in a U-space airspace. If this number is low, for example for safety reasons, then an application for a flight authorization is more likely to be rejected. If sufficient capacity is available, the question arises as to whether other UAS operators are also interested in the area in which you wish to fly. To avoid conflicts, the UAS flight authorization requests are compared with authorizations that have already been granted. For example, if you want to fly from point A to point B between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. and your flight path crosses a previously approved route, the USSP will reject your request. At this point, you could argue that the flights could simply be flown at different altitudes. And that assumption is not wrong. In principle, this is possible and also makes sense. However, there are some restrictions one should be aware of. For example, we can assume that the upper limits of U-space airspaces will be based on the minimum safe altitude of manned aviation in order to create a kind of natural separation from manned aviation. In rural areas, this is 500 feet or 150 meters, and over cities, 1,000 feet or 300 meters. It is still an open question whether, for reasons of simplification, the height of U-space airspaces will be measured from the ground, whereas the minimum safe altitudes apply from the highest obstacle within a radius of 600 meters of an aircraft. When measuring U-space airspaces from the ground, obstacles on the ground such as buildings, wind turbines, power lines, etc. must be taken into account. Unless it is an inspection of such structures, US operators will always want to fly above these obstacles if possible. It is also planned that buffers will be added to the drone's operational volumes, which significantly limits the available airspace. Due to these points, airspace capacity, avoidance of flight area overlaps, etc., it can be advantageous to submit the request as early as possible, provided, of course, that this is possible in terms of planning. But that's not all. If a request is approved, there is still a realistic chance that the flight will not take place, or at least not in the expected form. This is when another UAS operator submits a request whose operation has a higher priority. An example of this would be medical flights. In this case, your flight authorization would be withdrawn. Alternatively, the USSP would have the option of offering you a different time, or they could suggest that you adjust your flight routes. In that case, a modified application would have to be submitted. By the way, this rule applies at all times. This means that even if your UAS is already in the air, a flight with a higher priority can be introduced at any time, which in turn will affect your operation. Another restriction is weather. UAS operators must always ensure that their operation only take place in the weather conditions specified by the UAS manufacturer or covered by the operational authorization. The responsibility for this lies with the UAS operator. However, if a member state has determined for a U-space airspace that the Weather Information Service must also be provided and used, then the USSPs are required by regulation, when issuing a US flight authorization, to use the weather information provided by the Weather Information Service. The applicable means of compliance and guidance material, or AMCGM, address this aspect in more detail. Thus, member states may specify weather maxima or minima. The USSP would therefore have to regularly check whether these requirements are met on the basis of the weather forecast, which would then have a corresponding effect on the processing of UAS flight authorizations and their activations. And finally, there is the point, what actually happens if I do not activate my flight authorization in time? The USSP will assume that the activation of the flight authorization is based on the takeoff time stated in the application. If therefore the USSP does not receive an activation message by a certain time, referred to as the latest possible start time, the flight authorization should be withdrawn again, according to the AMCGM. I think it becomes clear from the issues presented that flying in U-space airspace is associated with a great deal of uncertainty for UAS operators regarding the actual feasibility of their flights. This brings us to our second point, a question that is rightly asked again and again by UAS operators. What is U-space going to cost? The short answer is, we don't know yet. USSPs are usually cagey when it comes to answering this question, and that's probably because we won't like the answer. But we can approach the question by taking a look at the situation of the future USSPs. The UAS operations market is still emerging. Urban drone traffic is currently virtually non-existent. This is certainly due to limited use cases, but especially to the high requirements that have to be met for operations in urban areas. If a U-space airspace is established in a particular area, all USSPs that have a matching certification can offer their services in that U-space airspace. In consequence, they have to share the cake with each other, and the limited number of customers is distributed across several providers. And even if demand increases over time, we have already determined that airspace capacity is limited and that the number of flights does not scale indefinitely. This means that costs would have to be spread across a limited number of customers. If we consider the expenses that each USSP has in order to offer their services on the market, in addition to the provision of the actual system infrastructure for the provision of the services, the following cost pools are particularly striking. A USSP must set up and maintain a system for reporting occurrences, a security management system, and an information security management system. On top of that, a USSP must set up and maintain a quality management system. The keyword here is ISO 9001. These are business processes that usually require qualified staff and thus are cost drivers. Providing U-space services will cost the USSPs quite a bit. But it should not be ruled out that there may be providers on the market who will offer their U-space services at low prices or perhaps even for free, at least in the beginning. In the long run, however, uneconomical operation cannot be sustained and must be subsidized in other ways, for example through advertising, or be discontinued. Another interesting question regarding costs is, when do operators actually have to pay for the service? Up front? At the time of requesting a flight authorization? Even if there is a chance that the request will be rejected or that the flight cannot take place? When the flight is activated and the traffic information service or network identification service is provided? Or perhaps only after a completed flight? The EU does not specify this, so it is up to the providers to decide how they want to organize it. And this may also become an important criterion for UAS operators when choosing their USSP. The fact is that we don't yet know anything specific about the costs, and we just have to wait and see how it is implemented in practice. Another aspect I touched on in my last video is the amount of time that UAS operators have to invest in setting up for U-space. In case you missed the video, I'll link it again at the end. If you are aware of any other disadvantages of operating UAS in U-space airspaces that I have not covered today, please feel free to write them in the comments. And let me know which of the points listed is the most important to you. I would be very interested in your opinion. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye!